Welcome to this episode of Halal Money Matters, sponsored by Sterling Capital. This is Moneem Salam. And in today's episode, it's an interesting one. Over the past few years, there's been a lot of talk in the investment industry and also amongst retail investors about what's called BDS, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. It's interesting because we talk a lot about that, and a lot of people, do know what BDS is. But when I was actually looking for a guest to come on and actually speak on this topic, I asked probably about 7 or 8 people if they would like to speak to me about BDS, just BDNS. I didn't explain anything at all, and about 5 to 6 of them actually said, "Can you please explain to me what BDS is?" So what I guess what I'm getting at is I think it's really important for us to be able to understand what is it exactly meant by boycott, divestment, and sanctions, how it actually impacts investing, and then how does that impact maybe returns on those investments that you actually have. Today we have a guest with us, Ibrahim Khan, a really good friend of mine, lives in the UK. He is actually the co-founder of Islamic Finance Guru, and also the sister investment company called Curate Capital. He holds a bachelor's in philosophy from Oxford, and also has his Alamiya degree. So he is a aspiring scholar by right, and currently traveling the world and really getting to meet people and making investments on the private equity side, but has a lot of knowledge on this area of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So we get into it pretty heavy, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Ibrahim, thanks for being on the show.
No, it's an absolute pleasure.
I've really wanted to do this particular segment for a long time. It's one of those things that's come up very recently, called BDS, right? Boycott, divest, and sanction. And it's been around for quite a long time. I mean, I think some people say that it was doing even the divestment from South Africa that actually started. And then recently it's resurfaced again after October 7th with Palestine. And I just wanted to get, a better sense of, from a perspective, what's effective, what's not, ethically, what's our responsibility versus the Sharia compliance part of it. And I couldn't think of anybody better than you.
Well, let's do this.
Okay,
I feel like I've drawn the short straw on this particularly emotive subject, but yeah, let's do it.
So, let's kind of break it down a little bit more. So define a little bit further what BDS is, and not just the name, but the actual, what is it?
Yeah. So the idea is, it was popularized by the Palestinian, civil rights movement, and particularly, I forget the name of the person, but particular people within that movement. And the idea here is that ultimately we want the apartheid that is existing in Israel-Palestine and the human rights abuses and the illegal occupation. These are all, just according to standard international law. This is how it's described. We want that to end. And how we think that's going to end is that Western countries in particular, but major countries across the world, are going to put sanctions on people that are breaking the law. And sanctions is the last bit of BDS. And in order for us to get to the point of sanctions, which we got to the point of when it came to countries like South Africa, for example, you need to actually build up to that point. And so boycotting is the first of those, and then divestment is the second of those, and then that ultimately creates the space for sanctions to become politically acceptable and something that you'd actually want to do. Boycotting is something that the individual does. Divestment, i.e. pulling your investments out of certain companies, is something that individuals can do, but also actually a lot of the time pension funds and institutions can do. And then finally, you've got sanctions. That's what only governments can do, right? So it's going up the chain of command of influence.
So let's break this down first. So let's talk about boycott for the first part of it. I mean, I've seen the strategy being very effective in, let's supposing if it's Muslims that are boycotting a certain brand, those type of things. I feel that it's much more powerful when, for example, in Malaysia, they had a boycott against McDonald's or Starbucks, for them to be effective, then maybe a minority community, for example, in the UK where you're from, or in the US or where we are. And so, is there an effective channel to be able to do that? Or is it really, you start with the most effective being sanctions, then the divestment, then the actual boycott?
Yeah, I think with boycotting, the power of it is not necessarily in the economic harm that you can do to a particular company, right? So let's say you've got a company like Booking.com or Barclays or someone like that who has, very clearly been documented in human rights documentation, human rights, the UN Human Rights Commission's documentations around supporting either directly or indirectly illegal occupation in occupied territories. Now, boycotting them would, in principle, be a good thing, but the challenge is that economically you're highly, highly unlikely to have any material impact on that entity, right? Especially because if you think about Israel, the majority of its trade actually happens with Japan, Germany, and the USA. And the majority of the Muslim countries, they don't actually trade with Israel. So you're not actually going to have that much of a direct impact. So actually, it's much more of a PR focus. That's what boycotting, the real power of boycotting is PR. And so therefore, if PR is the real power of it, then it doesn't make sense to boycott thousands of things. What makes sense is to boycott a few key things, and everyone boycotts them, but not just boycott, but then actually go one step further and actually talk to the companies and make people aware and, kick up a bit of a stink that this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, blah, 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 blah.
Kind of similar to like if you can make it effective in one or two companies, other companies might get a little bit nervous and kind of preempt any kind of a boycott that they might have.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Have you come across any examples of effective boycotts that have happened in the past?
I think there's been quite a few successful examples, even in this recent last few years, right? Where I think Puma were sponsoring the Israeli national team, something along those lines, and after a lot of pressure, they pulled out from that. I think you hear the companies like Starbucks have taken a very significant hit as a result of this. Costa Coffee, I think, are another one that have reported some pretty poor numbers, and a lot of it is being traced back down to this. You're seeing how the owners of a number of these American franchises in the Middle East, they recently came out a few days ago and they said that we're actively looking to try and buy franchises now in the Middle East rather than the American, KFC, for example, franchises that we have. And it's a weird one, right? Because KFC is, if you think about it, KFC is probably not directly supporting Israel in any way, shape or form, bizarrely, right? I'm sure there may be some like indirect support at some point by some, franchisee, right? But actually direct support, there really isn't any.
So in fact, you can go so far as to say that even if there was a franchisee that was doing it, contractually, KFC is limited in what they can do.
Correct.
And to effectively do anything about whatever that person's doing.
Correct. And it's so to some extent, I think people need to be careful about who they're boycotting in the sense of is it actually a fair target, A, and B, is it actually going to have any impact? I think with companies like, let's say, Starbucks, for example, where there are ties and where there could be said to be stuff that they're doing that is supportive of Israel, and there is a movement behind it, right? And there's a significant amount of media attention around it. I actually think getting behind a boycott like that can make sense because then it achieves the purpose of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. It achieves the purpose of creating a bit of a hoo-ha around it because that actually is the goal that smaller minority communities in a country can have an outsized impact with, as opposed to any kind of economic harm.
So the other one would be like, for example, if you look at Muslim countries, a lot of the people who are working at Starbucks and the people working at these places are going to be Muslims. And interestingly enough, this particularly happened in Malaysia, where the actual holding company for McDonald's and Starbucks, which happens to be the same, they actually came out and made this argument. It's like, why are you boycotting us? All you're doing is hurting your fellow Muslim Malays who are working there. For that. So any comments?
Yeah, I mean, look, I would be very sympathetic to that. I think that there is a fine line though as well. And I can understand why people behave in a certain way around particularly large corporates where senior leaders or some of the major shareholders have expressed support for Israel, or have been very supportive of Israel historically. So I can sympathize with that, and and I don't think, especially when you're dealing with huge corporates where there will be many good guys, right, in this chain, I don't think that alone is a reason to not boycott. But at the same time, you need to be careful that you're principled in your approach to the boycott. It can't be just, scattergun approach, firing left, right, and center. That person, looked at the map and saw Israel one day on it, and that alone is good enough for us to start boycott. Like, it has to be material support for, in my view, illegal activities.
Yeah.
Because if you don't have that principle line, then everything goes.
Yeah.
Which means it's not useful.
True. And then also the other part of the boycott, which is I feel is very important, is, I can stop, purchasing my coffee or whatever, my burgers from McDonald's, but unless corporate finds out about it, that boycott means nothing.
Absolutely.
We're just a little blip on there, maybe like a rounding error for them.
Absolutely.
So it's really more a matter of doing it and then making your voice known by making phone calls or emails or something along those lines. That's letting people know that you're actually doing it. And that's where I think a lot of people fail. It's like they think it's enough to be able to just, not do it, but it has to be one step further than that.
100%.
Yeah. Okay, great. So now let's move on to the second one, which is divestment, right? The BDS, so we got boycott, now we got divestment. So divestment basically looks at it and says, what am I holding in my investments, and then what can I, realistically sell out of to be able to make an influence on these companies. And the same kind of argument can be made, like, what kind of impact are you able to make from there?
I think it's actually the same impact here again, because as a Muslim, or as a Palestine activist, you probably won't be a huge number relative to the mass majority of people. So again, your pressure should be focused on looking to get larger pension funds, endowments, etc., to make their moves, right? So when I think the Norwegian pension fund, certain funds from the Nordic countries, they started actively divesting from companies that are, active in Israel, or, supporting the Israeli military complex. That was reported on by the Financial Times, and that then starts ratcheting up the pressure further on other companies and other funds and other pension funds, and you start seeing that cascade happening. I think that's the ultimate goal of where we want to get to, and that needs to be really borne in mind, because sometimes people think, oh, as an individual, I might be divesting from this, that, and the other, and frankly, I think from an economic perspective, it doesn't do very much. It makes us feel good. And I actually think we should do it, because that's the least that we can do. But we should also be very clear-minded as to what's the point of this. The point of this is ultimately create pressure on governments to put sanctions on illegal actors. And the thing before that is you want to get through to them by getting pension funds and larger corporates and big endowments to divest out, because that sends a far greater signal to governments than anything that we would say. So I think that's the goal. Now, in terms of specific individuals and the investments that they're making, I think it's absolutely vital that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and we have, again, a principled approach to boycotting and divestments in particular. Because if we don't, then this time we are actually just going to hurt ourselves and no one else in doing so.
Yeah, so we can talk about the hurting part just from a returns perspective and those type of things. But before we do that, I think there's also this idea, and we hear this a lot in the Muslim communities, like, do we follow the Sharia compliance part of it, or is it something more than that we have to look at when it comes to ethics and those type of things? I think the jury's still out, right, on exactly what it is, because you can easily argue that, there's one thing to be, halal or haram, right? And then the other thing is, within the halal, what are you actually doing, whether it be, permissible or recommended, those type of things. I don't think the scholars are there yet to be able to say whatever these things are from a Sharia compliance perspective, non-Sharia compliant or haram. But I think definitely nobody will argue with you on the within the halal. Where are you in regards to that?
Yeah, agreed. And I think on the ethics side of things, I do think we should be trying to move in that direction for sure, but it's a little bit more of a an individual type thing, and it's a bit more of a thing that depends on taste, because you're not comparing between impermissible evil versus good, permissible. You're comparing between something that's okay but not impermissible versus something that's good versus something that's even better, and that, I think, is a qualitative judgment that is very down to the individual's moral compass, and we should strive in that direction, but it's much harder to do.
Yeah, and in this regard, also, like kind of looking at it from principles. One thing I did want to mention, we talked about the BDS movement. It was interesting that when October 7th happened, when we looked at the BDS list, their information was extremely stale, right? I mean, I remember on certain companies, they had information back from the early 2000s. And so there was a catch-up period that was going on. And then now they're pretty up to date as to what they're doing. I hope this is not something that's just a fad and they're going to continue to even after, after this conflict is over. But which brings up an important point is that, I think it's important for not only an individual, but also fund management companies to have, let's supposing policies in place that go beyond certain incidences and really look at it from a perspective of, okay, what do we not invest in, generally speaking? So, for example,
Correct.
Defense is an area, right? So defense is an area, the scholars have said it's not, although it's technically permissible in Islam, right? It's not something that we want to be able to advocate. So we're going to keep that in the haram list or the non-Sharia compliant list. But even the definition of defense changes, or there are nuances within it. When this guidelines came out, or even, for example, prior to October 7th, AI in defense was never an issue. It's a very, very new topic. And there's a lot of emotions involved in doing that. So trying to balance between the two becomes quite a big of an issue. Do we do it on policy? Do we do it on emotion? And then what if those emotions lead to divestiture that actually ends up hurting your returns? Yeah. Then what do you do? So all of those things have to be kind of thought about.
So I'm to be honest, I'm not that worried about the return. I think it has to be a principled and ethical argument, and if it means less returns, then so be it, right? But then I think it has to also be practical. For me, I think the practical aspect of it is vital, because the Islamic law, the Sharia, the way of life that we have, it promotes practicality, and it promotes the ability to be able to live, life in an easy and practical way, and I think that's where some people for example, boycotting or divesting from Elbit Systems, which is a Israeli military company, is a complete no-brainer, right? You should do that. Or investing in Booking.com, which is a company that hosts a whole bunch of sites across occupied territories. That, seems to me like a no-brainer. But then you get into, more murkier territory where instead of, clearly going after illegal activities or support for illegal activities, you are going after, any semblance of historic support or transacting with Israel, right? Which is a much higher bar, and suddenly you're making impermissible large swathes of the US corporate landscape, and so for me, that's where you start having a question mark, which is, and it's not because we need to have enough of a universe to invest into, but it's more a question of, well, let's dig into why you think transacting with Israel is something that would be worthy of divesting from. Well, it's because it supports Israel, and Israel ultimately is committing these acts. If that was the case, then there's a whole bunch of Palestinians who are transacting with Israelis every single day.
They work there.
And they want you to transact with them, right? So that's okay. So that doesn't quite work. And actually, if support for Israel is the key thing, then the US government, the UK government, Western governments, they're actually probably the biggest supporters economically and politically, militarily, all sorts of ways for Israel, far more than some random company that might have once sold some Israeli company some nuts or some something. And so, do we stop paying our taxes? Do we move from these countries and move to somewhere else? Where do we go? Because I don't think it's straightforward to go to somewhere like the Middle East, even, right? Because that then comes with its own baggage. So where exactly do we go? And so it's pinpointing exactly what it is that we're trying to get at, and then applying that fully and seeing, is that actually a reasonable stance, a realistic stance to have? Because let's kind of boil it all the way back, right? Why are we making this position? Are we doing this because it makes us feel better, or are we doing this because we want to enact change? Because if it's make us feel better, then obviously go ahead, knock yourself out. But if it's to enact change, then I think it needs to be very targeted and very principled.
And I think that's where the policies come into play. And you can look at it. I mean, one thing is to look at it from an individual perspective, individual investor, who they can actually choose to buy something or sell something or not invest in one thing. It's a whole nother level when you're looking at it from a fund perspective, right? Funds, whether it be conventional or even Islamic, because a lot of Islamic funds you might find not from a halal and haram perspective, but maybe from a perspective questionable as to what they're holding. For example, if you look at Microsoft or Google or Alphabet, those kind of companies. So what I find is that having that policies in place actually helps mitigate some of that, what you're talking about, over the long run.
Yeah.
Right. It kind of smoothens out what is it that you are willing to do and what it is you're not willing to do. So, for example, if you're looking at defense as an industry, right? So, I traditionally used to always use the example of a tire company. A tire company's out there making tires for cars and for everything. They just happen to be making also tires for an F-16 or F-35, right? So, are you going to now divest from there because of a small component of that? So, having a policy in place that actually says what is it that you're going to do actually helps to be able to answer a lot of those questions. And we, using that to be able to now apply to software for AI helps quite a bit as well.
Yeah.
And really it's kind of tied together, the boycott and the divestment part of it. Because a lot of people might be thinking, I really don't want to be owning Microsoft or owning Alphabet. However, they might be listening to this podcast on a Microsoft, Windows operating system or on YouTube, which is owned by Alphabet. So where do you actually kind of follow in?
And I think in this day and age where we've got these larger companies that I think are essentially part of the fabric of our life at the moment, right? To the point where we can't realistically pull out from them. And you might be like, okay, well, I'm going to divest from them, but I've already bought this Tesla, or I've already bought this Apple phone, or this, I'm forced to use YouTube, and therefore I'm just going to have to do it. But the thing is, that actually directly, if we go under the hood, that actually directly gives money to these companies in a way that's, that they want, right? It brings in revenue. The stock market price is only indirectly affecting them, really. Right? Because that's just shares that someone else owns that they are buying and selling. So sure, it does affect them, through maybe bonus schemes and what have you, over a period of 3, 4, 5 years spread out. But actually, in today's day and age, today, the thing that really helps Microsoft or Google is you sat there watching a YouTube video, or you buying their software. So this person is actually supporting these same companies in a much more proximate, in a much more direct way than any divestment or investment would do, right? So and I think that then hopefully brings home the message that there are certain companies that are so particularly large that I actually think we should think of them really conceptually as governments. Right, their own sovereign entities at some level,
multinational
right?
corporations.
Because they've got so much money and so much power, and they're so deeply embedded into our daily lives that I don't think it's realistic for us to say that, just like it's not realistic to say, we're going to leave the USA, or we're going to leave, paying taxes, we're going to give up our nationality. I don't think it's just like that. I don't think it's realistic to say we're going to give up Microsoft or Google. But do we then use our other means available to us to try and influence these companies? Right? If you think about, I think I was looking at, was it Microsoft or Google, the pressure that some people are putting onto Islamic funds, such as Saturna's, to divest from someone like Microsoft. I was working it out, and I think it came to something like 200 billion out of Microsoft's total, 600 million out of Microsoft's total, market cap of several trillion or however.
Over 4 trillion, yeah.
And it's like 0.02%, or I can't remember the exact number, but it was a tiny number. Yeah. And that's not going to affect Microsoft in any way, shape or form. What will be much more impactful is this same group of people who, rather than divesting, actually use their influence as shareholders or use their influence as individuals and write to Microsoft or campaign for Microsoft and actually use the voice as opposed to divestment necessarily in this instance tactically as the best mechanism to influence Microsoft in a certain direction.
Yeah, no, and arguably you can argue that it's like even sometimes shareholder votes and those type of things for the board of directors and shareholders, those are annoyances. I think what does is very effective that what we've seen is in our investor meetings with these companies, right? You're asking the questions that need to be asked. Whether you're not going to get an answer or not, you might not get an answer, but at least you're asking the questions so the investor relations is aware, and they will bring it up to the higher C-suite individuals, because we're talking about shareholders at a certain point. So and ownership is there. So I think there's different methods of being able to kind of where does your voice stand to benefit more than just simply saying I'm not going to do anything at all.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing, Ronim, that someone might listening to this might think, what a bunch of sellouts, right? This is, you're kind of whitewashing all of this, and this is such a compromised position. To which I would say that we are living in a casino, is how I put it, right? We're living in a casino, and there is a prayer room within this casino. And the question that we are debating right now is, what carpet should this prayer room have? And I really care about this particular color, and I really care about this particular color. And, let's, think about the decor in this room. What we are not, if we take a step back and we think, why are we getting so upset and het up about this when the real goal should be, let's deal with the fact that we're living in a casino, right? And we have to accept the economic system that we have today and the way that the entire world, macroeconomics is set up, is fundamentally run on, an interest-bearing system and a whole bunch of other things that make it, not necessarily the ideal economic system that any of us want to live in. And once we accept that as a fact, then we realize that there will be some level of compromise that we are going to be, involved in at some point in our economic lives. It might be the bank account that you are forced to use that is propping up an interest-bearing debt system, right? That same bank may well be then lending to the very same corporates that you are divesting from. So this is not about whitewashing. This is not about, trying to justify things post hoc. This is actually about saying, let's be very, very tactical and clear-minded about what is it that we care about, and then really tactically figure out how are we going to go about achieving that in the most impactful way possible within the parameters of what we have available to us as levers to pull in today's day and age.
Yeah, and also the other part of it, and it's more, and it's if you as an individual owner, if you wanted to sell your stock, perfectly fine. But there are also in the United States for sure anti-BDS laws. Right. So, for example, if Microsoft one day decides they're not going to sell into Israel, that's illegal for them to do that. They're not allowed to do it. And so, again, there's very, very nuanced. It's people want to think it's black and white, and the emotions come out when it's black and white. But I think it's a lot more complicated than that. And I think that's we all try our best to be able to do what's right for as a fund, because we're not individuals. We're there for maximizing shareholder value. We have to do what's best from an Islamic perspective, but across all the different shareholders that are there. It's a very fine line that we have to
totally. And I think if people really want to make change, then ideally we want to create companies that are fully Sharia compliant, full stack, right, top to bottom, and that looks like helping founders that are deeply ethical, Muslim founders. They don't have to be Muslim, but founders who are deeply ethical and will align with, values such as we don't want to deal with interest, or we want to have a lot more of an equal society, or we don't want to, the whole bunch of things that the Islamic tradition believes in. And if we are building companies and funding companies like that, often from the ground up, because there's not that many companies like that, that's when over a period of 20 to 30, 40 years, we could even have a mana fund that doesn't have any interest-bearing debt allowed in it, 30% or otherwise. There's no haram income allowed in it, 5% or otherwise, because these are, compromised positions that Islamic scholars have allowed and have done for the last 2 decades because of the absence of anything else.
Yeah, and I really want to emphasize that, because this, in the long run, let's suppose in the next 50 years, 100 years, this was a stopgap measure. It wasn't, this is not like these companies are halal because there's nothing else that's available, right? It was based on the concept of hajjah that they actually allowed it. It wasn't just generally speaking, they said this is allowed. And so really building those companies, like Malaysia has a term, they like to distinguish between Sharia compliant and Islamic, right? So Islamic means like your pension fund, your bank accounts, everything from top to bottom is actually from an Islamic perspective. And then you have Sharia compliance, which is, yes, you can be within 33% or not be involved with more than 5% in a certain area, that type of thing. And those are Sharia compliant. I think more and more companies, eventually as we kind of assist them growing and those type of things, hopefully we'll have a diversified portfolio of companies we can invest in that are all Islamic.
100%.
To do that.
And I think this is where the private markets comes in, right? So investing in private equity, investing in venture capital, setting up your own business, right? If you've got entrepreneurs in your family or your community, support them and give them that encouragement to be really ambitious, so that they are then the next big publicly listed company.
Yes.
And
learn the rules to how you keep it Islamic.
Absolutely.
At the same time.
Absolutely.
Because there are, yes, absolutely. I mean, just to be making sure that from the beginning, from the get-go, you're trying to do things Islamically. So you're not trying to do it after you're the 20 million, 30, even $50 million company, because it's a lot harder to change at the end.
100%.
Rather than the beginning. So thanks for that. So now we talked about, the boycott. We talked a little bit about, a lot about the divestment part. So let's come to the last one, which is the sanctions. And from a impact perspective, I do think that sanctions are probably the most impactful when it comes to changing policies in other countries. I mean, that's why, for example, the U.S. puts sanctions on, let's say, Russia or China or those type of things. But they are also the ones that take the longest time to be able to implement, just because of have to change voter sentiment, and thus the government itself.
Yeah. I think the US, with its sanctions against certain countries like Iran, for example, has been deeply damaging for Iran. And I think any sanctions that the US puts on countries have been deeply damaging for them. I think for a country like Israel, I don't think it'll just be damaging. I think immediately that you will see changes, because Russia is a huge country and it's got lots of trading allies, right? But Israel is so dependent on America that if the US were to implement sanctions overnight, I think they would immediately jump to the tune of whatever it is that the US government asked them to do. And I think that's and they may not even have to go particularly far in the sanctions, just the threat of them, the fact that they've now been implemented, this first of them have been implemented, I think that's all it will take for this to go away.
That's true. And I know just a general area, I know we've been talking about specifically Israel, but in this case, you can talk about it from even, the Chinese, what they do with the Uyghurs or anything along those lines. Of it will take time for that to happen, but it is a constant effort, because I do remember prior to October 7th, the China and the Uyghur issue was important. And then all of a sudden it dropped off. And so now there's no pressure on the U.S. to do anything at all. So I think it has to be something that's more sustained over a longer period of time, but you have to put in the time and the patience to be able to see it through.
Yeah.
Right. It wasn't, even in South Africa, it didn't happen overnight.
Agreed.
It took years upon years of kind of convincing a lot of people.
And I think you make a great point about the Uyghurs, because I know the Palestinian cause is particularly emotive and sensitive for us all, right?
Yeah.
And myself alone, like we were, everyone felt impelled and moved to do stuff after October 7th in 2023. But if we take a cold, hard look at things, why is Uyghur suffering, or why is the Rohingya suffering any less, or why is the Sudanese suffering any less than the Palestinian suffering? And why is it that we really focus on this? And sure, it is one of the third holiest site for Muslims, so that clearly will have something to do with it, and there's a lot of history associated with it. I get all of that, but we should be led not just by our emotions, in fact, perhaps not at all by our emotions, but just be led by what does God want us to do, and does He distinguish between these 4 or 5 or 6 different ethnicities or nationalities? He doesn't, right? We're all equal in the sight of God, and therefore it actually comes back down to, rather than back solving for this particular conflict, it comes back down to the point where you were making, which is, let's come up with principles that we can stand behind in all conflicts or in all scenarios, because this will blow away, inshallah, one day, right? Or hopefully very quickly, but there will always be something. And so let's be principled about it.
And then just one last thing on this idea, BDS. What are your thoughts? And I'm not asking for a scholarly opinion, but what are your thoughts about why scholars haven't touched this issue? If you have a thought on that,
as in coming up with a criteria. I think it's a deeply political issue, right? And you've got these Sharia standards that are located in the Middle East, in Gulf countries, and there's a whole bunch of politics around that already, right? Because you've got very strong ties between America and Europe and Middle Eastern countries, and there's a lot at stake. And I think that naturally has either subconsciously or perhaps even consciously, I would suspect subconsciously, has a bearing on how these standards perhaps.
That's interesting. You're taking it from. I was actually thinking of it from a practical perspective, not from a political one. So, for example, like you cannot, like no scholar will come up, because as you know, from an Islamic perspective, labeling something haram is a very, very big thing. It's not to be taken lightly, right? So if you look at something like you mentioned, Elbit systems or Palantir technologies in the U.S., those have a clear tie to some type of defense, some type of weaponry, something offensive, right?
Illegal action.
Right, illegal actions. You can say this is haram. But when it comes to something like a Google or Microsoft, it's much more complicated. And to label something as haram, I don't think scholars are willing to do it, because it's such a heavy thing to be able to do. And I think, so that's why they've kind of said, well, we have these defense, parameters that we have in the Sharia compliance. We have these other parameters. As long as you stick to these, you should be able to navigate through whatever it is that you're doing.
Yeah.
Because, for example, very early on in days, Malaysia actually, they could have easily come up with a list for BDS, because they have no political ties to Israel or Middle East and that type of thing, but they didn't. And I think that's one of the, as I talk to scholars,
that's interesting.
That's what they've told me, is like, we don't want to label something haram, to speak in God's name, in something that's this serious, rather than saying, maybe makruh, right? It's detested.
Yeah.
Like, it's the farthest they'll ever go to be able to say that you should stay away from it.
Yeah.
So, any final thoughts before we close off the session? This has been great.
No, I think it's honestly a very tough, landscape to navigate, and I think everyone who has these feelings, it shows that their heart's in the right place, because they want to do something, and I think the strange thing about this particular conflict is how it seems that we can basically do nothing. Everything that we do try and do, it doesn't seem to have an effect, and it is like shouting into a void, and it doesn't seem to be making an impact. But I think that shouldn't then lead us to start shouting in the direction of things, or going down into actions that ultimately are not principled and possibly even harmful to ourselves.
Yeah, and I think what I would just add to that is that, we all have this inner desire to do something, but let that do something be something you do with wisdom. And the wisdom comes through patience. It comes through, thought out policies of what you're going to be doing, what the end result is, those type of things, rather than just picking up the latest trend that somebody else is doing and saying, this is what I want to follow. And
I know you want to end this, but one thing that I think really nicely captures this is Moses, when he was growing up in the house of the Pharaoh. The Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he wanted that to happen.
Yeah.
He actually, he got Musa to be in the house of the biggest bad guy in the Quran.
Yeah.
Right? The biggest bad guy in the Quran actually brought up and looked after and, nurtured Musa alayhi salam. And so if you go back in time, would these same people be then protesting Musa and saying, Musa, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Why are you in the house of the Pharaoh? What's this all about? But everything in its right place and at the right time.
Yeah, it's interesting. You just brought up a really interesting, and again, I know we were trying to end this, but it's really interesting to note, you brought this up, that, you could easily make the argument, well, the people of Beni Israel didn't know Musa was there, but they actually did, because he was having interactions with his brother. He was actually having interactions with the mom and the community itself, because they know who he was. If you look at the story of when he actually killed it says in the Quran that it was from his tribe. And the person who was actually leading him on was from his tribe. He knew that. So there was a constant back and forth Musa had between Bani Israel, right, and the Israelites and the people of Pharaoh, which is an interesting dynamic if you think about it, because he was in both worlds, and there was no comment by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to criticize it, or the people criticize anything along those lines. It was just a very fluid situation. Interesting. Well, thank you so much, Ibrahim, for your time. I know, like you mentioned, it's a very, very heated and controversial subject, but I appreciate having to spend some time talking about it from a very non-emotional, but yet effective way of being able to tackle the issue. So thank you for your time.
Oh, Jazakallah khair. It's been a pleasure.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for listening to Halal Money Matters. If you like what you hear, please do rate us on the app stores and also leave us a review. It helps other people find us a lot easier.
The thoughts and opinions expressed on Halal Money Matters do not necessarily reflect the views of Saturna Capital, Amana Mutual Funds, or their affiliates. Please consider an investment's objectives, risks, charges, and expenses carefully before investing. To obtain this and other important information about the Amana Funds in a current prospectus or summary prospectus, please visit amanafunds.com or call toll-free 1-800-728-8762. Please read the prospectus or summary prospectus carefully before investing. The Amana Funds are distributed by Saturna Brokerage Services, member FINRA and SIPC, and a wholly owned subsidiary of Saturna Capital, the investment advisor to the Amana Funds. Investing involves risk, including the risk that you could lose money. The Amana Funds restrict investments to those companies consistent with Islamic and sustainable principles, which limits opportunities and may affect performance. This material is for general information only and is not a research report or commentary on any investment products offered by Saturna Capital. This material should not be construed as an offer to sell or the solicitation of an offer to buy any security in any jurisdiction where such an offer or solicitation would be illegal. We do not provide tax, accounting, or legal advice to our clients, and all investors are advised to consult with their tax, accounting, or legal advisors regarding any potential investment. Investors should not assume that investments in the securities and/or sectors described were or will be profitable. This podcast is prepared based on information Saturna Capital deems reliable. However, Saturna Capital does not warrant the accuracy or completeness of the information. Investors should consult with a financial advisor prior to making an investment decision. The views and information discussed in this commentary are at a specific point in time, are subject to change, and may not reflect the views of the firm as a whole. All material presented in this publication, unless specifically indicated otherwise, is under copyright to Saturna. No part of this publication may be altered in any way, copied, or distributed without the prior express written permission of Saturna Capital.
Securities mentioned in this podcast episode. The Amana Funds hold the following securities mentioned in this podcast episode as a percentage of net assets in each fund as of December 31st, 2025. Amana Growth Fund, Microsoft 5.4%, Alphabet 7.1%, and Apple 7.54%. Amana Income Fund, Microsoft 8%. Amana Developing World Fund and Amana Participation Fund do not hold any securities mentioned in this episode.